Hello everybody and welcome back to Bearded 40K. Today we have a new kind of video. We're doing a new series, first in a series. And but before that, I don't know if you guys have seen this. GW just teased yesterday the new Rogue Trader. What looks to be a box game is going to be released. Excited for that. Let me know your thoughts on that if you have any info that is not, common knowledge at this point. I think it's going to be a board game. I'm not sure. I guess it could be its own narrative skirmish, but to me it looks more like it's going to start out at least as a board game. Maybe, that's how Necromundo's new release happened too, so maybe there'll be expansions and all that stuff. Still no word on Kill Team. Sad about that. I got my sad face on, but what are we going to do? We're still waiting on that. So welcome to the first in the series. I'm going to make on a few videos I'm calling The Art of Warhammer. These are videos, it might be a long series, might be longer videos, might be a mix. But they're videos on basics that can be applied to our beloved game. And I recommend you watch my dice video if you haven't already to get a feel for what these videos are going to be like. So these videos are going to focus on the meta aspects of 40K. And meta is a word that gets thrown around a lot in 40K discussions, but I'm talking about the actual definition, meaning the really big picture. We're going to take a step way back and look at 40K kind of holistically, and then kind of move in on smaller details later on. So the goal of these videos isn't about telling you what to think, okay? I'd rather teach or give ideas about how to think in an efficient and tactical way, as well as perhaps a philosophical way. And it's interesting how often those two things can kind of come together. So everyone has heard of the book, The Art of War, and The Art of Warhammer is kind of a riff on that. We'll try to simplify some of these kind of core concepts and principles that have been successfully, used on real battlefields for many years, and kind of think about how they can be applied to the tabletops of Terra. And while we're doing that, I'll try and give my own additional perspectives and insights as well, in the hopes that they kind of help you to form a more complete picture for you to view your army through. So these videos will hopefully be the most use to newer players, but older veterans of the Long War will hopefully find some thoughts and inspiration as well. So let's look at the first concept. We're talking about playing to your army's strengths. This video is going to be in at least 2 parts, so look out for the sequel to this edition of The Art of Warhammer fairly soon. Now today's video is on identifying your survival strategy, aka specialization. See, every army is different. Every army has its own unique strengths and challenges, and because of this it would be a bad idea to treat 2 armies identically. Of course, that isn't possible, but I think that a lot of people, kind of don't delve into, a lot of what makes their army unique and special and identify those things right at the bat. So, every army has its own strengths and challenges, and because of this, it would be a bad idea to treat 2 armies, interchangeably without giving that consideration to what makes your army different. Now, there's principles, like what we're talking about in this series, that can be applied to every army, but Tyranids are not Custodes, for example. One playstyle involves spamming large amounts of small, cheap units, and the other involves dedicating massive resources to elite, expensive units. And this might sound simple, but again, it's something that a lot of people ignore. And, it's kind of crucial when you're thinking about making lists, things like that. So these 2 fundamental differences that I'm talking about, they're found in nature, in the most ancient battle for survival that nearly every living thing on Earth is a part of. Now, this difference that nature does that very closely mimics what's happening on the tabletops is called the K-selected versus R-selected survival strategy, if you were to look this up in biology. And it's very interesting. If you're into this kind of thing, maybe look it up. So what is K-type versus R-type, or K-selected versus R-selected? For an example of this, you might hear whistling in the background of some of my videos. I have pet birds. Now, the survival strategy for my little parrots, my little birds, is very different than the survival strategy for insects, for example, something like a mosquito. So baby birds, I raise these things up by hand. I have 3 generations in my living room, and basically, when they're born completely naked, completely helpless. Their eyes aren't even fully formed, so they're blind. They need to have supplemental heat, or else they get too cold. They can't digest their food. Their metabolism slows down. And so you have to feed them every 2 to 3 hours at first, and then gradually start pulling those feedings back as they age. So, at 2.5 weeks, they're at like 4 to 5 feedings. and then, blah, 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 blah. Now, for some larger birds, like cockatoos, that can take 5 months of requiring hand feeding every, couple hours or a few times a day as they get older. And in the wild, these birds are being fed by their parents, sometimes even up to a year or even more after they've already left the nest and are technically, what people thought for a long time, out on their own. So this is a big investment. And then, so the parents have to invest in this little animal, and then it takes that little animal at least 1 to 10 years, in many cases, to reach sexual maturity. Now contrast that with a mosquito. A mosquito is going to produce millions of offspring. These offspring develop rapidly. They don't get any care really from the parents other than selecting where they're going to be. And so that takes a lot less, resources and parental investment for that, offspring to reach maturity. So if you were to compare the two, you'd see that the mosquito invests much less in their offspring's survival than my little birds do. So simply put, if a parrot, my little birds, one day decided to try to use that survival tactic that mosquitoes use to win the game of life, they would lose. Their biological makeup simply does not allow this. And the same is true for our armies in Warhammer 40k. All you have to do is look at recent tournament lists and you'll see the battle between K-type versus R-type biological specialization, a proxy of that taking place in top lists. Why? Well, art imitates life. So before the recent FAQ nerf, Death Guard was a top army, and they worked a lot like the mosquitoes we just talked about. Their tactic was to generate tons of models with ease, with very little investment. And now these poxwalkers were not very impressive on their own, but when you got dozens of them, and a few dozens of them, they became a force to be reckoned with. Now if you look at something like a Custodes list, on the other hand, they are successful with a few units of like 3 to 5 troops each. So this split in tactics has been around a long time in 40k. And I mean, look at how devastating armies like Demons were in 7th edition. So it was that same thing. We're going to take a few expensive heralds, but we're going to use those to spawn a bunch of free or low-cost little models here. So it's important to remember that one strategy is not better than the other, so keep that in mind. Either of these will work, but the point here is at the start of the series that we're doing this Art of Warhammer, I kind of want you to discover and identify your army's survival strategy. What is your army's niche? And how can you use this in your list building without getting distracted by other things? Because which one of these things you most closely seem like your army fits in, that is your survival strategy. That's your specialization. And messing this up, well, just like nature, can lead to extinction. So listen to the descriptions here and tell me in the comments what armies you think fit in each group and what grouping your particular army seems to fit best in. So group 1, R-type. R-selected species are those in nature that emphasize high growth rates, typically exploit less crowded ecological niches, and provide or produce many offspring, each of which has relatively low probability of surviving to adulthood. So in simple terms, this means it's an army that puts out a lot of cheap models on the table, they have a low probability of surviving, and they perform a more generalized role on the battlefield. So what do you think, what kind of armies do you think that is? When I hear this description, I think of things like orcs, Tyranids, and Imperial Guard that to me seem to embody this strategy the most. Now contrast that with K-selected species, on the other hand. They possess relatively stable populations. They tend to produce relatively low numbers of offspring. They tend to favor individuals that can successfully compete for resources, hint, hint, and produce few, slowly developing young, resulting in a stable population of long-lived individuals. So again, put more simply, this description relies on expensive, survivable offspring that can successfully outcompete most rivals in a 1-to-1 matchup. So if you were to take one Poxwalker and one Custode, gee, who's going to win? It's not until you start getting a ton of those Poxwalkers or a ton of the Chaos Cultists that all of a sudden those cheap little units start to become a threat. It's because it's a different survival strategy. Now, the K-selected are more expensive, but they're more survivable. They have a more defined and specific role on the table. Things like, oh, these are my Melta guys. These are, you know, the firefighting unit. This is what's going to go and take and hold objectives. So this description, when I think of that, I think of things like Grey Knights, of course, Custodes we mentioned. Also, I would think of like Necrons, and probably like Eldar would fit in there. So this is the point when you take things to the next level. You know, and why would I have you think about this? Well, once you identify your army's niche in the way that it will function best, it's time to revisit your lists. If you're an army with the strategy of a mosquito, ask yourself, do I really need this extra 150 points of equipment on my HQ, for example? That is a big thing that I see a lot of times, and it doesn't fit with your army's survival strategy. So ask yourself, do I really need an extra 150, 200 points of equipment on my HQ, or should those points, or could those points be spent somewhere else that would improve my collective swarm army as a whole? So once you've thought of that, look at your list and see where weaknesses might come from your army's specialization. If you need to have a lot of bodies that die easily, that's fine, but it's probably better not to have a bunch of small units that are going to get wiped out easily. It's probably better to make, just like the mosquitoes, swarms of models and less or fewer units, rather than spreading those easy-to-kill models out into several smaller ones. So, to illustrate this point, imagine you play Chaos Space Marines and you run a list that takes 40 cultists. It is probably better to take all of that in like 2 squads than to take 4 squads of 10 cultists. So does that make sense? The reason I'm saying this is because you want to limit kill points. Since you know your army's survival strategy is using lots of things that aren't going to survive, you want to minimize the damage as much as possible. I hope this is clear. And if you're using an army that is more like the little birds, the parrots, ask yourself if every unit has a purpose or multiple purposes planned out before they hit the table. Ask yourself, do I really need that additional non-specialized unit? Do I really need this much chaff? Or can you eliminate that chance for an enemy to gain a victory point? And use that cost to further buff your investment somehow. So these types of questions, what I'm hoping will hopefully help you do is clear up any clutter or inefficient aspects of your list, as well as helping you to make a more informed purchasing decision when you're paying the points for your list. Instead of going on Facebook and asking, well, what is the right unit to add? Or what do you think of blank? Ask yourself, why do you need another unit? Do you even need another unit? What purpose do you need it to do? How much are you supposed to pay for that based on your army's playstyle? Because at the end of the day, the real question is, does that fit the survival strategy of your army?